quite true. I'll be remembering me, whatever else I do. Midnight, where the stars are.
Welcome back to Historic Tahlequah, and we're here at Bank of America discussing the old First National Bank. And we had just mentioned D.O. Scott, who became president in 1915. And I believe you said that when you came in 1975, you remembered him somewhat or knew who he was.
I remember him from conversations with customers. Mr. Scott was well thought of in the community. The theme that was constant was how he knew everyone's name. He knew everyone that came in the bank by sight. He knew everything about their business. Many joked about him having a photographic memory, but he was well liked and well respected, and so I knew him only by name. Never had the opportunity to meet him.
Well, as a very young person, I remember him, and it seems as though I remember he always wore either round or oblong-shaped little wire-looking glasses that were dark, and he was a very serious man, very, pleasant with his customers, but very serious. And Howard Upton, who succeeded him as president of the bank, was vice president then, and he was a very portly gentleman, and they were both very dignified gentlemen in the community that you could depend upon. And they were active in civic affairs. And I've heard it said that Mr. Scott could be responsible for a civic fundraiser of some sort for a good cause, and that he could always solicit more funds than anybody else who was working in the in a campaign of that kind. And D.O. Scott was from Ohio, I believe, as I have read, and I think it's really interesting to know that his wife's maiden name was Allender, and they named their son Allender Scott. And of course, there are members of that family in this community. In fact, Beverly, if you didn't know, behind the camera today is his great-grandson. So I don't know what he'll do about our appearance. We hope he does as well.
It's possible.
And there are some other names that I wanted to mention in this segment who had something to do with the bank, early day businessmen that people would like to hear about, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Well, there was J.B. Crew, who had the drugstore across the street.
Just right across the street, yes.
And Mr. Pyatt, who was a merchant here, and he had come from Arkansas. A lot of the people came into this section from Arkansas, of course, and became businessmen here. Saw opportunities for growth, I think. And J.B. Pearson was...
That's not familiar to me.
He was on the board of directors for the bank for a number of years. His brother taught at the university, and all of these gentlemen were somewhat different to some of the businessmen today who are a little more relaxed. They were suited and tied and very dignified gentlemen. I don't know whether they were always that way, but they gave that impression. And Mr. J.W. McSpadden, who was active in civic affairs, and E.E. Starr, who was treasurer for the Cherokee Nation for a time, back in the early day, was one of the people. I've already mentioned Houston B. Teehee, and I think it's interesting that Howard Upton, who was vice president when Mr. Scott was president, was married to Marjorie Ross, and her husband was a grandnephew of Chief John Ross. So the connection there is historic in this community. And tell me, when we were off camera, you were telling me about your customer, things that tell you why people come to this bank and what they say about tradition are.
Well, what we hear quite often, and I've been with the bank for almost 35 years, and what makes this still so enjoyable for me is that I have the opportunity to now be introduced to the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of customers that I met in 1975. And when you ask what made you decide to bank with Bank of America, and they can respond to you with, this is our family's tradition, it certainly gives you an appreciation for the contribution that the bank has had on our community and the lives and the families that live here.
Well, yes, it does. And now, Beverly, when we, before we complete this segment of Historic Tahlequah, I want us to talk about the time you've been here, because you came in 1975.
In 1975, the bank was under construction, so the facelift for the building was taking place, and my first assignment was to report to the bookkeeping department, and to get there, because the building had been gutted and all of the construction was taking place. I climbed a ladder and walked a plank over to get to the then bookkeeping department, and that was even prior to computers being commonplace. We weren't introduced to personal computers until later on in the 70s. So it was a very interesting, very different. The basics haven't changed. The basics in banking are the same, but technology has certainly changed the way that we do business.
Well, we're going to have to take a break again, but when we come back, I want you to talk about who was president and what your job was, and then the growth that you see and the changes in the bank. Can we do that
Absolutely.
in our next
Love to, Beth.
segment? Well, don't go away. We'll be right back.